Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. I'm Terry McCarthy, the President and CEO. You're very welcome tonight. I'd just like to mention some of our board members here tonight. Mimi Donahill is here tonight. Ina Wynn Howard and Jason Sturman, you're very welcome. I'd also like to mention some of the schools. We have quite a number of schools here tonight, which I'm delighted to see. As you know, we have a regular roster of high school students that come to our programs. We think it's a great idea. We've got 5 schools tonight: the Ambassador School of Global Leadership, Central City Value High School, the LA Center for Enrichment Studies, South High School, and Vaughan Next Century Learning Center. You're all welcome. Thank you for coming. Our speaker tonight, Governor Bill Richardson, former governor of New Mexico, has an interesting history and an interesting, what shall I say, schedule of countries that he visits. Most of these countries other people would not go to. I looked at a list, and it includes Iraq, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Cuba, Sudan, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and my personal favorite is North Korea. I've only been there twice. The governor has been there considerably more times than that, I believe. And it's had sometimes some interesting experiences, which he'll no doubt talk to you about later. Governor Richardson was born in Pasadena here in California. An American father. His mother is Mexican, as you might know. And he was brought up in Mexico City until he was 13 years old, which gives him a particular understanding of the ongoing immigration debate in this country, which we're now hoping to readdress in the Congress. He was governor of New Mexico, as you know, from 2003 to 2011, where immigration was an issue he probably had to deal with on a daily basis. And he has been making repeated calls to the Congress and the White House to find some solution to this problem, which has beleaguered us for so long. He's a graduate of Tufts University. He was a congressman from New Mexico for 14 years before he joined the Clinton administration in 1997, where he served both as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and also as the Secretary of Energy. We would like to welcome Governor Bill Richardson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for that very, very wonderful, positive introduction. All Terry said is totally true. And this is my 3rd visit to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. I was here, I think, about 5 years ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was here maybe about 10 years ago. I recall this is the 3rd time. And what I'm going to talk to you about is Terry has asked me to cover, like, a lot of issues. Some of the missions that I've taken that are outlined in this book called How to Sweet Talk a Shark, Negotiations with Difficult Countries. President Clinton used to say the reason he'd send me to North Korea or Sudan or Cuba is that bad people like me. And, you know, the thesis of my foreign policy and domestic policy is that you've got to talk to your opponents. You've got to have a dialogue. You've got to have some kind of diplomacy resorting to resolving a conflict as opposed to using the utmost weapon, which is the military option. But I think there's several phases before. I had a great talk with a bunch of students before we had this wonderful dinner. And after my talk with these students, I'm very encouraged. I was encouraged by the diversity of the students from every, not just Los Angeles, but from every walk and country of origin, and the melting pot of the Asian Hispanic community that is so prevalent here was there. And as I traveled through Los Angeles, and by the way, I was born in Pasadena. You didn't hear that. And I'm often asked, well, what are your local ties here in California? What is your commitment to California? And the truth is It's a strange story, but my father was an American. He was in the armed forces, but he was born in Nicaragua. And he had this complex that he was not born in the United States. He would hide his passport. He would, like, it was this thing. And so he was determined that his first son would be born in the United States. And he had a sister in Pasadena. And he brought me and my mother just to be born in Pasadena, in America, and we went right back to Mexico City. So when I was running for president, which, by the way, Mr. McCarthy, you didn't mention that. I know I didn't last very long. I like to say in the presidential race, I had two problems in the Democratic primary, two problems, Obama and Clinton. Other than that, you know, everything was good. But I remember, this is just my short discussion about California. In the presidential race, I was having a fundraiser here in Los Angeles, and by the way, a lot of you that are here were helpful to me. I see Artie Gastelum here, and many of you and by the way, the assemblyman is here. Where's the assemblyman from Orange County? Thank you for being here. He's got a very promising young Iranian American who's thinking of running for Congress. And you know, getting to the end of this story, this woman came up to me at this fundraiser, and she said to me, well, I see you were born in Pasadena, and you were born at Huntington Hospital, and we'd like to have a fundraiser. And I said, well, that's great. Who would be the fundraiser for? She said, Huntington Hospital. That's supposed to be funny. I guess it wasn't. But what I'd like to talk to you about, and by the way, this book that I've written, I want to give credit to my co-author. He's a very funny guy. He worked for 8 years for the Jon Stewart Show. And when you read this book, it doesn't just say, okay, I met with Saddam Hussein, I met with the North Koreans. It tries to apply what are the lessons when you talk to a bad guy, a dictator, to your daily life when you negotiate with your mother-in-law or your father-in-law or your kids, or, you know, when you're buying a car, you're trying to get a raise in your job. We try to connect that. But this book, I had written one before that was dull, but this one, because of this guy, I want to give him credit. His name is Kevin Blyer. Please stand up, Kevin.
I
understand. Yeah. Stand up, Kevin.
Stand.
So I'm going to cover, the first part of my discussion will be the United Nations. You know, the United Nations, I was ambassador there for several years in the Clinton administration. And it's often maligned. You know, the UN is not important. The UN, let's just use it when it's important to our national security. Terrible managers. Let's not pay the debt and make the UN be more responsive to America. The criticism of the UN in many cases relating to its management is spot on. However, when it comes to dealing with crises, whenever there's a Bosnia or an issue relating to war and peace in Africa or in Syria or any other trouble spot around the world, the UN is the first recourse of action. It is the first time that world powers will meet to discuss a crisis. And just the fact that it brings instantaneous scrutiny to a world problem, I think merits the UN the value that it deserves. Now, there are problems. The UN Security Council, potential vetoes by two members, Russia and China. The United States, Britain, France, generally allies, China and Russia in many places, as what's happened in Egypt and Syria, blocking potential action to bring sanctions, to find other ways of diplomacy to relieve a crisis. But what the UN does that many don't know about is it deals with those problems in the world that nobody likes to talk about. pandemic diseases, sexual exploitation of children, child prostitution, climate change, something that is desperately needed with our planet saying that we as a planet need to do more to protect the earth. Issues relating to refugees, to displaced people, tribal and ethnic wars. Nobody cares about Africa. Do you know that there's 7 wars going on there? But somehow, I'm not saying we're deaf to those issues, but it's the United Nations that tries to bring nations together to deal with a lot of these problems. Now, admittedly, there's some issues we don't want the UN to deal with. We don't want them involved in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I remember many times votes where the United States and Israel would stand together because a block of anti-Israel votes would form that were 180. And we always had the United States standing with Israel and usually one other country, Samoa, and that was it. And we'd lose those votes. So there are many times and many issues where the Middle East peace process is something where the United States acts on its bilateral interests. When I was ambassador at the UN, it was a fascinating job. It was a fascinating job. And I remember President Clinton calling me and saying, "Bill, you're doing a great job." I said, "Thank you, Mr. President." This was the time when you recall the whole Lewinsky stuff, and he had his friends, and he was feeling pretty besieged. And he said to me, "Well, Bill, you're doing a great job, but I want you out of the United Nations." And I said, "Well, why? I like it here. Aren't I doing a good job?" "Yeah, but I need you as Secretary of Energy." And I said, "Well, why, Mr. President? I'm very happy here. And furthermore, I don't know much about energy." He said, "Don't worry about that. That's not a criteria." But he said to me, "Federico Pena has just resigned as Secretary of Energy, and I need a Hispanic in the cabinet." That's when I knew that being Hispanic was sexy. So I took that job. It was a good job. But I loved the UN. And what I said to these young people that asked me, "Is it worth it being a member of Model UN?" I said that you're all international citizens. And one of my main points today, and Terry kind of said this and when he asked me to speak, was America's role in the world. And I know we've taken some hits with this shutdown, which makes us look dysfunctional. I know we've had problems with our economy, and the international economy is not well. And, all these flare-ups around the world, and the emergence of China as one of the great powers. I want you to know that as I travel and as I go around the world, people still look to us for leadership. On every issue. They want to know what we're going to do. On this shutdown, they'll say, "Will you get your act together? What are you people doing? My God, you're acting like Italy. You're acting like banana republics, but we expect you to lead. Get the economy together. Get the dollar strong. Find ways to participate and lead." So our country is strong. And still that moral leadership, we're expected to make that difference. Now, diplomacy. I'm not a traditional diplomat. I've been in the State Department. But I think as this book will tell you, I've negotiated for ceasefires and political prisoners in North Korea, in Bangladesh, in the Sudan, where, by the way, when there's a vote on who the world's worst dictator is, it's always President Bashir of Sudan. He beats the North Koreans hand down. And I found also one negotiation in the late 90s with Saddam Hussein. And I'm going to tell you about 2 negotiations, one with Saddam Hussein and one with the Sudanese. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about North Korea, and then I'm going to take some questions, because I think what we want to do is get into a dialogue And again, I'm not in the government now. I'm a supporter of the president. I'd like him sometimes to be a little bolder. But I think our foreign policy generally has moved in the right direction. But there's some areas like North Korea, some areas like in the Middle East. I'd like us to pay more attention to Latin America, more to the immigration issue, which I think is essential that we resolve. But what I'd like to say is about these two negotiations, it involves how I think you deal with people. Like when you're in a negotiation, when you're talking to somebody that you love, or you're trying to get something, or in this case, advance America's interests with a dictator, I think it's important that you always set a tone. You show respect, cultural respect for the other side. You learn as much about your opponent reading and talking to people that have just talked to that person. You use humor. I think it's very important to break the ice. The good thing about negotiating with a dictator is that dictator doesn't have to go to a Congress to get something done. You might convince a dictator and get what you want, either a prisoner, or a ceasefire, or some kind of peace movement. So it's very important that you establish a personal connection. Two of my more significant negotiations, one was with Saddam Hussein. I don't know if you recall this, but this was in the 90s. There were two American contractors that had been there for 6 months in prison by Saddam Hussein. Our relationship with Iraq was terrible. Sanctions, we were about to, this was a few years before the invasion, but we had conducted military strikes. So Jesse Jackson, Jimmy Carter, the State Department had tried to get these two Americans out, but they weren't able to. So they called on me, and the Clinton administration, a member of the National Security Advisor, said, "We have no objection to you pursuing these negotiations. If they succeed, we're going to take some of the credit. If you fail, we don't know who you are." And that's okay. At least you know where you stand. And so we had these side negotiations for me to go to Iraq. I ended up there, to make a long story short, and I was told by the foreign minister, if you convince Saddam Hussein on a one-on-one meeting, you could probably get the Americans to go, but don't count on it. So I went and sat down and waited for him to come in. I remember him, very big guy, sparkling uniform. He had knives and guns, and he had his Revolutionary Guard enter the room. And I knew he was trying to intimidate me, and he had succeeded. We sat next to each other, started making my case for releasing the two Americans. And I remember all of a sudden, Saddam Hussein ran out of the room. And I looked around at the interpreter. I said, what's going on? You insulted the president. He's leaving. You must apologize. And so I recall thinking, what am I going to do? Why should I apologize? Well, in my briefing books from the State Department, which I hadn't read because I was very tired, it said, do not show the soles of your shoe to an Arab. It's the supreme insult. And I had done that, right in his face almost. I'd crossed my leg, I was tired. Dictators like to grab you to negotiate when you're tired and when you're not in your best faculties. And I had to make a decision because I said, is he coming back? Is it over? Am I a hostage now? He'll come back, the interpreter, but you must apologize. He came back and he sat down. And I had to make a split decision. Do I grovel and say, oh, Mr. President, I'm so sorry, I'm a cretin, I have no cultural sensitivity, I'll never do that again? Or do I just not apologize? I decided not to apologize, but I was very respectful. And I think Saddam Hussein looked at me, and it was like a little measure of respect. You know, his beady eyes, he kept staring at me, and I kept making my case. And then all of a sudden, he says to me, by the authority vested in me in Constitution number 15, I hereby turn over the 2 Americans to you. And my first reaction was, my God, he's going to give me the hostages. So I moved over and grabbed them, and the Revolutionary Guard swept upon me, thinking I was going to commit an assassination. We stood up, and he said, I'm going to call the press in because I'm going to make this announcement. I know I'm not getting much out of this, but you've convinced me to release the Americans. And then he says, by the way, this is Saddam Hussein. With all the press coming in, I want you to know that having a photograph with you in Iraq is not good for me. He said that to me. I said, well, Mr. President, being photographed with you in the United States is not good for me either. And he looked at me, and there was like a little smile. We cracked things a little bit, the personal connection. The press left. And one of the other lessons that I left in that negotiation is when you get something from a dictator, when you achieve your goal, get out, leave, because they'll change their mind. They'll get mad, or there'll be some press report, a leak, get out. So I said, well, Mr. President, I have to leave. I have votes in Congress. It was not true. If he checked, we were in recess, you know. And he said, no, 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 no. I noticed that before you came, you wanted to go to a Catholic service. I know you're Catholic. Tariq Azi's wife is a Chaldean Catholic. That's the closest that we have here. And she's arranged for you to go to church. I said, no, Mr. President, I gotta go. I gotta get back. No, no, you gotta go to church. So I said, all right, I'll go. And I went that afternoon. But I recall as we left his palace, he said to me, but by the way, with this church issue, don't stay too long in confession, because otherwise you will be late to your votes in Congress. And then he smiled again. He was making a joke that my confession was very long. Don't you get it, or what? That negotiation was the toughest, because he was somebody that tried every trick to wear you down, to get a concession. Will the president say thank you to me, President Clinton? I said, no. The only thing you're going to get is I'm going to say that you did the right thing. That's all you're getting. But, Mr. President, that's all. I don't know what else you can get out of keeping these 2 Americans. You're keeping them from their families. Let them go. So that happened. The second was in Sudan, in Bashir. This was about 4 years ago. I was governor of New Mexico. A journalist from the Chicago Tribune by the name of Salopek had been captured by the Sudanese. And you know our relationship with Sudan is not good. But I had been in the Sudan 12 years before and had rescued 3 Red Cross workers that had been holed up in a rebel camp. And when I left, I said a nice thing about President Bashir. I thanked him for his help. And when I returned, he actually remembered that. We had this meeting, and I had brought Salopek's wife, and my instructions to Salopek's wife were, when I bring you in to meet with the president and we make the plea for your husband, I want you to do one thing. And she said, what's that? I want you to start crying, and that you really want your husband. So I recall during the meeting, you know, I kept making the plea to Bashir, and I looked at her. She's a very accomplished woman. And she wouldn't cry. I said, I almost went, stop crying. She finally did. And in the course of the discussion with Bashir, there were 3 hostages. There was Salopek, but he also had 2 black Malians from Mali that carried his equipment that had been put in jail with him in the southern part of the country. And I went back and forth with Bashir. You got to let him go. You're getting nothing out of this except bad press. And I was good to you when you let me get those 3 Red Cross workers, Mr. President. And he kept looking at me, and he said, okay, I'm going to let him go. I'm going to let Salopek go. And I said, thank you, Mr. President. I said, will you send for them? Because southern Sudan is like 3,000 miles away. He said, no, you got to go get them. I said, oh my God, all right, I'll go get them. But he said, the two Malians, they're enemies of the state, enemies of Sudan. They don't go, they stay here. And I said, Mr. President, I can't leave with just one. I got to get them all. And then I said, what am I going to do? This is going to be a disaster. I'm probably going to have to take the American, but it's not going to look good. And so I said to him, Mr. President, we're both politicians. We had a reporter from the Associated Press with us. I may run for president. I said that to him. And he says, well, you will be my candidate if you run. I said, well, don't say that here. And I said, you've run for president. He'd gotten like 98%. He had like some ghost opponent, but he thought he had won a legitimate election. I said, Mr. President, we're both politicians. How's it going to look if I take the white guy back and leave the two black guys? That's not good for me. And he looked at me. I thought he was going to either shoot me or incarcerate me. He started laughing, and he laughed, and he laughed, and he went around his desk and called some of his cabinet members in and told them the story. And he comes back to me and says, okay, get them all out of here. My point here is that in a negotiation, sometimes a subtle use of humor is good. Sometimes it doesn't work. But in these cases, when you're negotiating high stakes, you have to roll the dice. North Korea. North Korea is a country that is probably the poorest on earth. It is a country that you enter a time warp, like the 1940s and 50s, one of the poorest nations on earth, but also one of the most dangerous. 6 or 7 nuclear weapons, 1.5 million men in arms, 28,000 American troops on the DMZ. We have a treaty with South Korea. If they're attacked, we have to be part of that. Nuclear weapons coupled with missiles, underground nuclear tests, and a leader named Kim Jong-un, 30 years old, that we know nothing about. We know he went to school in Switzerland. We know he is now the leader consolidating his power. We think that the bad elements of the military are controlling what he wants to do with his country, which is continue more weapons, not feeding his people. But we don't know. And when I was there with Kevin in January of last year and Eric Schmidt of Google, we had gone to try to get an American, Kenneth Bay, out of jail, spread the internet message. But Kim Jong-un, the new leader, wouldn't see us. He wouldn't meet with us. He decided instead to meet with Dennis Rodman, the basketball player, a week later. And they both watched the basketball game. But what I have found in dealing with the North Koreans is they don't think like we do. It's not a quid pro quo. Their culture does not negotiate. It's a cult of personality, and everything the dear leader or the great leader, that's how they call that family, dictates what you're going to do. They get no information. They are prescribed every day about 3 hours of television, which constantly shows the evil of America and the West and the heroic leadership of the North Korean first family. But it's a country that I think as a nation, it's important to engage. And as I've said, I'm supportive of the president's policies. But I think with North Korea, not talking to them, ignoring them, isolating them, I wonder if that is the right policy. We have a similar choice with Iran right now. I'm skeptical of the mullahs, I always have been. I worry about the security of Israel. I think Israel is in a very dangerous neighborhood with Hamas, Hezbollah, Lebanon, the entire situation in Syria falling apart. And I can see Israel's concern, but I think we have to respond to this overture and see if they're serious about terminating their enriched uranium. I think it's worth a shot, and we have to see if it's going to work. Again, diplomacy. What has worked in Iran is the sanctions that the Western powers and the United States have put on Iran. They import their gasoline. They import half of their food. Their oil production has gone down 50%. The squeeze, the pressure has brought them, I think, to the table to negotiate. But that's where I see us, in the end, finding a way, maybe, to stabilize and reduce tensions in that region. Immigration, I believe, is so important, immigration reform. The worry I have after the shutdown is that somehow there's not going to be time this year to deal with a comprehensive immigration bill that legalizes the 12 million undocumented workers, that increases border security, that penalizes those that hire illegally many people. A comprehensive bill that I think a majority of Democrats and many reasonable, moderate Republicans, it's just a faction that doesn't want to see it happen. It has political overtones, the growing Hispanic vote in the country, and where they're going to go. They're not an automatic vote, but they generally have gone to Democrats. Issues relating to our workforce. Are we going to be competitive? The H-1 visas, the educated immigrants that can stay in this country. But I think passing an immigration reform bill, it's good for our deficit. It brings tax revenue, increases the gross domestic product. It also is the right thing to do. So I've covered the waterfront, but my final message, especially to all the young people, and nobody asked me, well, I'm thinking of running for office. And my last message to, and it's not just to young people, is that public service is a noble cause. Now, it's not the most lucrative, it's frustrating. In these days of social media, people can say anything they want about you without much response. But especially to the women that are here, there are not enough women that run for office. And if one of the young people had said, what should I do if I want to enter politics? My answer is run. That's why I'm telling my friend from Iran, should I wait for like the next guy to move up and then there's a position? No, go for it. I was elected in my 30s. I ran the first time and I lost. Be prepared if you run for office to lose the first time. I mean, it's better to win than to lose, but be prepared. But there's nothing more noble than throwing your name out and trying to make a difference, especially in our country, in your community here, with so many issues relating to growth and the environment and clean air and traffic. You got to do something about your traffic problem here. I'm going to talk to the mayor. Maybe I can solve it. No, I'm kidding. But anyway, I think we're going to take some questions. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. And I look forward to some good, tough questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Richardson. So who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll come to you.
Governor Richardson, a pleasure to hear you speak. I am very concerned, I'm very political and read every newspaper every day, about WikiLeaks and what Angela Merkel now and all the other European countries thinks we are tapping their personal cell phones. And it seems like it's a condition brought about by this person. And what can the government do about it?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be popular with this answer, but I want you to know that I think this guy, Edward Snowden, and the WikiLeaks guy are not good people. I think they've hurt our country. Who are they to decide that they should disclose secrets? Nobody elected them. I think in the case of Snowden, something went wrong with his security clearance. They sure missed something. You know, it's embarrassing when the world knows, and when you're dealing with complex negotiations. We want our diplomats, for instance, on WikiLeaks, in Egypt, to be candid with their assessments of foreign leaders and foreign issues. So they print things, well, we think President Mubarak is losing support, he's weak across the board, and maybe they've said that about a lot of other leaders. Now, I believe the White House, when they said they haven't been spying on Chancellor Merkel, the National Security Agency, and probably the NSA has maybe gone a little too far in some cases. But I want you to know, when I was in the cabinet, I got those NSA and Intel, I won't say leaks, information, and it was good. It was useful information for me to get assessments of what my opponent in a negotiation was going to say to me. Valuable information. So I think the NSA and the CIA are taking a bad rap. I mean, the latest is, I was on today, if you watch me, and O'Reilly, he beat the hell out of me today. But he promoted my book, so I went on. And then Wolf Blitzer asked about, you know, Chancellor Merkel, our ally, she's mad about that we had her phone number. Well, the White House denied that, their cell number. When I was in the NSA never asked me for people's cell numbers. So it's reached a point where no matter what the government says, nobody believes them. And so, you know, the press, and I believe in a free press, it just runs with this stuff, and everyone thinks, oh, it's true, the NSA is spying on my cell phone. If I make a call overseas, that's not the case. But there is surveillance that is going on. It's in the name of national security. I can't justify every one, but I think the answer is a court. There should be a court, and there is a court, or it's getting strengthened, called the FISA court, where 3 judges get a request from the government. Is it okay to wiretap this person because we think that that person has ties to Al-Qaeda? That court decides, and I think that's fine. That's the way the process should be. I know I talk too much on this, but you know, as a negotiator, you don't want the other side to know what we know. And now, because of Snowden and this WikiLeaks guy, what's his name, Kevin? Yeah, there's a movie about him. I don't know if it's any good. But these guys are lionized. You know, these are great. I don't think so. I think they're not criminals. They've made a criminal act. I don't think they're traitors. And I may be wrong. That's my gut feeling. And if anybody wants to challenge what I said, I'm perfectly willing to listen.
Governor, I understand you have visited North Korea a number of times for the last 20 years. As a Korean American citizen and also as a member of World Affairs Council, I really appreciate your effort and interest in peacekeeping in Korean Peninsula. According to Korean newspapers, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un recently made inflammatory speeches saying that he will hoist his North Korean national flag to the South Korean Blue House within next 3 years. Do you really think this young North Korean leader will cause another Korean war in 3 years?
I don't think so. Here's why. The North Koreans always, if you look at their last 10 years, they use bluster and threats and ridiculous statements to get the world's attention with the hope that the world is going to say, oh, please, North Korea, don't act crazy. We'll give you money and food and fuel and energy. I don't think he will. The danger, though, what needs to happen, the most important step in the Korean Peninsula, is for the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons. That's the worry. And the worry I have is that they're not going to go far enough, or they won't do that, and that keeps the tension going. But will they attack? You know, if we went to war with the North Koreans, it'd be a matter of days. They wouldn't last very long. But what you don't want is to put so many men and women, especially our 28,000 with all those landmines there, South Koreans, you know, in a situation where you start a tinderbox war. But no, I don't think. Kevin was with me in North Korea. Kevin, what do you think? Stand up.
I'm standing up. I agree. I feel like it's a repeated cycle where they suggest things so they can get aid. As we know, they're not always the most forthcoming on that. Oh, thank you. You know, the famous story is that they get a lot of their aid from China when these things happen, and that aid is sent by train to Pyongyang, and a few times in the last few decades they've said thank you for the aid and thank you for the trains.
Right.
So yeah, they're not always, but I agree with the cycle, the idea being that they will suggest that they're going to go to war so that they can be appeased.
Okay.
One more question from the student table.
Right, okay.
Hello. So on that same topic of North Korea, given that China does have quite a bit of influence, especially in that part of the world, and especially given all of the regime change that's happening in Asia right now, what steps should the United States be taking to protect American interests in the coming years with all of the regime changes that are occurring in East Asia right now?
Okay. This kid's a future diplomat. At the meeting we had, I mean, there were several that they're so smart. What are you, 16, 15? Yeah, so you're an old man. But I'm so impressed that, you know, that maybe the school system here is a good one. Okay, so what should the U.S. be doing? Several steps. You mentioned China. China has leverage over North Korea because they provide food, fuel, investments. But China in the past, even though we've pushed them, has not put pressure on North Korea. Why? I don't think China wants a whole score of millions of refugees from North Korea coming into China. And this is, again, my theory. I don't think we should fear China. I think they're our strategic competitor. But why should China want to help us in North Korea? They like the tension. They like us being uneasy. That's my theory. So this is why, until recently, they have not put pressure on North Korea, but I'm getting signals that they finally are, that they're tired of the North Koreans kind of, you know, flexing their muscles and acting crazy and causing problems. Like, they don't like the Chinese that the U.S. increases our military presence, our ships in Asia. So I think that's having an effect, and I think we should continue to work with China to do something about cooling North Korea down. The second thing that I would do, and the administration has said they're willing to do this, is to talk to the North Koreans. Say, okay, so why are you doing all this crazy stuff? Do you want more sanctions on you? Do you want more countries not trading with you? I mean, how much more punishment do you want to take? All right, here's the deal. Shut down your nuclear reactor. Let's find a way for you to use the nuclear reactor for peaceful purposes. Your people are starving, so we'll get a whole bunch of food. We'll find a way for you to have green energy. When Kelvin and I were there, their schools, they had no electricity. Everybody had these big jackets. You'd go into university, it was freezing. They had no electricity. So I think, again, a negotiation needs to happen, but somebody's got to start talking. And, you know, we've got so many other fish to fry, other problems around the world, the economy, the shutdown, Syria, Iran, the immigration issue in Latin America, which I think is so important, that somehow policymakers, you know, they say, geez, we can't take every issue on at the same time. So they put it on the back burner, and that's, that's something that I believe needs to be in the front burner, because this is a country that is so unpredictable and has so many weapons.
Before Terry comes back to close the meeting, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. And I've been to both of your earlier visits to the World Affairs Council.
Was
so
this
thank you.
better, or was the other one better?
They've all been great. Thank you. We're facing a new paradigm in Congress, the way there's budget negotiations, which didn't happen in the way it did in the past. We're facing a lot of people who I call austerity jihadists, who issue their austerity fatwas, and they're not really based on economics. We're talking about people who the word compromise is a dirty word, and they have districts to go back to that they don't really have to answer to the general public. So they're really not interested in compromise. You're the negotiator. How do you negotiate in this new era where either you're Congress, you're the president, or maybe even John Boehner? How do you negotiate with people who refuse to negotiate?
Okay, well, that's obviously nobody had a quick answer on that one. But I'm going to tell you what I would have done. And I did a little op-ed in the Washington Post that outlined some of the things that I suggested. And nobody listens to me, but I do think that new approaches were needed. The first thing I suggested, since both sides were so bitter and so negative at each other, it gotten personal. I'm talking about the White House and Congress, and then the leaders of the Democrats and Republicans in Congress. Like they were like hating each other. I said, hey, you guys need a mediator. You need a new voice in there. And I suggested two people. I suggested two former Treasury secretaries, one a Republican, Hank Paulson, the other a Democrat, Tim Geithner. They know budgets, they know taxes, they know the Congress. Let them set up a framework that might come up with a deal. That's the first thing. The second thing is I said the White House, the president, should get everybody in one room in the White House and say, we're not going to leave until you guys make a deal with me. In other words, shut the doors down, put them all in the Lincoln bedroom, set a deadline. That works in negotiations, but what was happening is the Congress and the senators, they like to show off. They like to talk to the press. They want to be on Meet the Press and This Week, and Wolf Blitzers say, oh, we're tough, we're the Tea Party, and the Democrats, oh, you're the Tea Party, they're crazy. Keep people away from the cameras, keep them away from their caucuses, and that's by concentrating them in a room. I mean, look, I don't know if this would have worked, but a lot of things they were doing weren't working. Third, test the Tea Party. I sent a little message to Boehner. I said, I don't know how many Tea Party guys there are. I heard there were about 40, 37. And what Boehner was worried about is his speakership. If he doesn't get those 40 votes, if somebody else runs against him, he probably loses his speakership. So I said, test them. See if they really would vote for a shutdown and the debt limit. Give him a test vote. He wouldn't do it. I mean, he finally did at the end when they conceded. But sometimes when you've got bullies, test the bully in a negotiation. See, okay, do what you have to do. Show me your stuff. That's another thing I would have done. Then the fourth thing was, okay, everybody knew sort of the outlines of a deal. Find ways to, for instance, Obamacare, take it off the table. The president's not going to concede on that. It's his biggest domestic achievement. Although, today O'Reilly beat me up on that. The website that nobody can, that wants health care, they can't, the website doesn't work. Well, I don't know if it doesn't work, but nobody can get information, and that's not good. As much as I like the administration, they should have worked this out. They should have gotten a good website or whatever, bring these young people that know technology to run it. But all these contractors, they make millions of dollars. I had the same problem as governor on a lot of the technology. I'd hire these people. Are you going to fix this thing? Oh, yes, sir, governor. $20 million bucks later, it was worse. So I would do that. Kevin, what's the last thing we do?
Save face.
Let the other side save face. That is really important. I mean, Boehner was in a corner. I would have, okay, let's find a way to, we all announced the agreement, everybody gave something, and in the negotiation, everybody did give something. The Republicans, I think, ended up losing because they gave up the debt limit that's, you know, we didn't tinker with that at least till February. The government reopened. So the president got that. Obamacare is left alone. I mean, it's having problems on its own. Although I think it's the right thing. I know this is debatable. So what did the Republicans get? They got more spending cuts, negotiations on that, tax reform, corporate tax reform to bring more incentives to the economy, and the last thing is entitlement reform. In other words, how are we going to save enough in Medicare and Social Security, the growth rate, to make the system viable? So that was always an outline of a deal, and I think you needed mediators to push that. Do I have to, is this the last question? Do we have time for one? I'm ready to, you know, I'm not.
Bill, could you tell us what you do to make a living these days, number one? Number two, talk about Texas. Texas, will it ever be a purple state? What's going on down there?
Okay. All right. Let me do the first one. I'm a private citizen now. I'm doing a bunch of things. One, I'm in with the Washington Speakers Bureau, where for giving boring talks like this, I get paid. By the way, I'm doing yours for free. But you did put me up at the shutters, and, you know, the private plane was great. No, I'm kidding. No, you did. I like doing groups like you. So speeches, I do maybe one every 10 days. Energy, foreign policy. Secondly, I do work with this company called APCO, one day every month, a speech somewhere, consulting international business stuff. Third is I serve on boards, nonprofit and for-profit, generally renewable energy boards, solar in Spain, Mexico, United States, technology boards. And then I have two foundations, one both in Santa Fe, one that deals with getting political prisoners out of sorry places and hostages. We have a little staff that does that, negotiates with North Korea, and then with countries that have difficulty with the U.S., like Cuba. I've been trying to get this American Jewish leader, Alan Gross, out of jail there. I've not succeeded. And then on the domestic side, I have a foundation that I started about 2 months ago with the actor Robert Redford, you know, the Sundance Kid. He's now 77. I'm betting he's going to win an Oscar. You know this business well. He's got this new movie, like The Old Man and the Sea. Remember the Hemingway? Well, Redford is in this movie on a boat rowing for 2 hours with no dialogue. And you watch, he's going to get nominated at least. You know, I said, Bob, maybe you could tell a joke. Or he said, no, it's just, you know how these guys are. Anyway, he and I set up a foundation. My passion is, as a Westerner, wild horses, saving wild horses. And there's some people that think that the problem and the danger of overpopulation of horses is to kill them. And I'm not going to permit that. So we've sued, and we've made an agreement with the Navajo Nation, which was basically slaughtering horses because they were tearing up the Navajo land. And we're going to have alternatives like adopting these horses. Anybody want a wild Mustang? Adopting horses, PCP, which is population control, sanctuaries, working with this woman, Netta, from Horse Freedom. What's her name? Netta. Jesus, Kevin, help me out. Crazy. Netta DeMilo, very from Santa Barbara. You're not much help, for Christ's sake. How did I negotiate your deal with me? Not good, huh? You love the way this guy writes. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody. Just let me cast you forward to some upcoming events. We have Peter Baker, who's the chief White House correspondent from the New York Times, coming on November 5th with some inside stories of what's going up there. On November 15th, we have the head of the Navy, Admiral Jonathan Greenert, who's coming. And then on November 18th, we have Elon Musk. As you probably know, the governor's just written a book, so if you need to know how to negotiate with sharks, dictators, or I guess street parking fine attendants, go and buy the book. He'll do a signing outside. We thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you, friend. We didn't talk about Northern Ireland.
That's another day.